The single porcelain teacup, its rim chipped like a crescent moon, was the last thing of beauty Lynn owned. It sat alone on the rough-hewn pine table in her cabin, a silent testament to a world she had left behind, a world of silk banners and crowded streets, of family and the smell of ginger blossoms. Here, in the Nevada territory of 1878, there was only the smell of dust, the silence of the high desert, and the constant, grinding work of survival. She had inherited this small homestead, a square of stubborn dirt and a well, after her husband Way had died working the railroad line 2 years prior. As a widow, the land was hers, a strange and lonely freedom in a country that saw her as little more than a ghost. Her survival depended on being invisible, a quiet woman in a plain dwelling who troubled no one. But trouble did not always need an invitation. It arrived that afternoon on legs that could barely hold its own weight, a man of such immense size he seemed to block out the sun. He staggered out of the shimmering heat haze, his clothes ripped and caked with alkali dust, his face a mask of exhaustion. A gun belt with a heavy revolver hung low on his hips, marking him as a man of violence, the very thing she had traveled half a world to escape. Every instinct screamed at her to bolt the door, to hide and wait for him to pass or perish. He did not see her as he fell to his knees beside her well, his huge hands clawing uselessly at the wooden bucket. A dry, rasping sound came from his throat, the sound of a man dying of thirst. Lynn stood frozen in the doorway of her cabin, her hand on the latch. He was a danger. He was a stranger. But he was also a human being at the absolute end of his endurance. Something in his defeated posture broke through her fear. Way had been a gentle man, a scholar forced into the body of a laborer, but he had always said that the smallest act of kindness was a prayer the heavens could not ignore. With a deep breath that did nothing to calm the frantic beating of her heart, she stepped out into the blinding sun. She drew a fresh bucket of water, the rope rough against her palms, the splash of the cool liquid an impossible luxury in the heat. She filled a tin dipper and walked toward him. He looked up as her shadow fell over him, his eyes barely able to focus. They were a startlingly clear gray, like a winter sky, and they held no malice, only a deep and profound weariness. She extended the dipper, her hand trembling slightly. He stared at it for a long moment, as if he couldn't comprehend the offering. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he took it from her. His fingers, calloused and scarred, brushed against hers. He drank, his throat working convulsively, the water spilling down his chin and onto his dusty shirt. He drained the dipper, then another, and a third. Finally, he lowered it, his breathing still ragged. He tried to speak, but only a hoarse whisper emerged. "Thank you." Then his eyes rolled back in his head, and his massive frame collapsed into the dust. Lynn stood over him, the empty dipper in her hand, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She had just invited a storm into her quiet life, and she did not yet realize the winds that had driven him here were following close behind. She dragged him inside, an almost impossible task that left her gasping for breath and her muscles screaming. He was all solid bone and sinew, heavier than a side of beef. She got him onto the simple cot in the corner, his long legs hanging off the end. As she cleaned the grime from his face with a damp cloth, she saw the man beneath the dust. His features were stark, carved from granite, with a strong jaw shadowed by several days of stubble. A long, faded scar ran from his left temple down to his cheek, a white line against his sun-darkened skin. He was a man well acquainted with hardship. He slept like the dead, his breathing deep and even, a low rumble in the quiet cabin. Lynn sat at her table through the long, hot afternoon, watching him, the chipped teacup a fragile sentinel between them. She did not sleep that night. She sat in her chair, a heavy iron skillet in her lap, and listened to the coyotes cry to the moon. The next morning came with a sky the color of pale copper. Lynn was outside, feeding her few chickens, when she felt it first, a low vibration in the soles of her feet. It grew into a distant thunder that was not thunder. She looked to the east, and her blood ran cold. A dark line had appeared on the horizon, a smudge of dust that grew and thickened, resolving itself into the shapes of men on horseback. There were dozens of them, a wave of grim riders moving with a single, predatory purpose. They were coming for her cabin. Her first thought was of the man inside. She ran back to the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was already awake, standing, his height making the small cabin seem like a child's plaything. He had heard them too. He was buckling on his gun belt, his movements economical and sure. "You need to hide," he said, his voice a low gravelly sound, no longer hoarse. "This is my home," she replied, her own voice surprisingly steady. "There is nowhere to hide." He looked at her, his grey eyes taking in the simple, worn silk of her pale pink dress, her small stature, the resolute set of her jaw. A flicker of something, perhaps regret, crossed his face. "Stay inside. No matter what you hear." He stepped out onto the porch just as the riders began to surround the small homestead. They fanned out, a loose circle of hard-faced men with rifles held casually across their saddles. A man at their head dismounted, his boots sinking into the soft dust. He was dressed better than the others, in a black frock coat and a clean hat. He had a neatly trimmed beard and a smile that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. "Morning," he said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. He swept his hat off in a mocking gesture of politeness. "Jedediah Kane, at your service. We're tracking a man. A very large man. Answers to the name of Booker. Seen anyone like that pass this way?" Lynn stood her ground in the doorway, her hands clasped before her. "I have seen no one." Kane's smile widened. "Is that a fact? Now, my associates and I, we have a different opinion. We believe you have. We believe he's in that little shack of yours right now. It'd be a shame if we had to get rough. A real shame." The giant called Booker stepped forward, moving to stand beside her on the porch. He was unarmed except for the pistol at his hip, but his presence alone was a challenge. The nervous energy rippling through Kane's men was palpable. "Leave her out of this, Kane," Booker said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Kane chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Booker. Always so dramatic. You look like hell warmed over. I see you found some charity. Though I must say, your taste is exotic." He let his eyes roam over Lynn in a way that made her skin crawl. "This is between you and me," Booker repeated. "Oh, it's about a lot more than that," Kane said, his voice dropping its friendly tone. "It's about a debt. And you, my friend, are going to pay it. Boys," he called out to his men, "looks like we found him." But Booker held up a hand. "Before you do anything foolish," he said, his voice carrying easily across the yard, "you might want to ask Mr. Kane here about the payroll from the Carson City Freight Office. The one he told you was lost in a rockslide. Ask him why his pockets were heavy with silver coin the next week in Virginia City." A murmur went through the assembled riders. Kane's face tightened. "Lies from a desperate man." "Am I lying?" Booker continued, his gaze sweeping over the outlaws. "Or ask him about Billy Cobb. Kane told you Billy ran off with the stash from that bank job in Elko. But I saw Billy's horseback at Kane's private ranch 2 days later. The horse made it back. Billy didn't." The men were shifting in their saddles now, looking at each other, then at Kane. The seed of doubt had been planted. Booker wasn't fighting with a gun, he was dismantling Kane's authority one carefully chosen word at a time. He knew their history, their secrets, the fragile loyalties that held the gang together. Kane saw he was losing control. His face was a thundercloud of fury. "He's trying to divide us. Take him." But no one moved. The moment of hesitation was enough. Booker had won the standoff without a single shot being fired. With a snarl of pure hatred, Kane remounted his horse. "This ain't over, Booker. Not by a long shot. I'll be back. And I'll bring everyone." He wheeled his horse around so violently it reared. As he galloped away, his men trailing uncertainly behind him, he shouted back over his shoulder, a parting shot meant only for Booker, but Lynn heard every venomous word. "The deed is as good as mine, Marshal. And so is everything on it." The dust settled, leaving an ringing silence behind. Lynn looked at the giant beside her. He seemed to have shrunk, the immense tension leaving his body in a long, weary sigh. Marshal. The word hung in the air between them, a question she was almost too afraid to ask. Back inside the cabin, the heat was suffocating. The confrontation had left a foul taste in the air, like lightning had struck too close. Lynn handed Booker a cloth and a basin of water. He sat heavily on the single stool, which creaked in protest, and began to clean a shallow gash on his forearm she hadn't noticed before. He called you Marshal, she said quietly, breaking the silence. It wasn't a question. Booker stopped his work. He looked at his hands, then up at her. For a long moment, he said nothing, and she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he reached down and pulled a worn leather wallet from the top of his boot. It was stained with sweat and dust. He didn't open it to show her money. He carefully unfolded a piece of yellowed, creased paper and laid it on the table. It was a land deed. The legal description of the quarter section she was standing on. Her husband's name, Wei Chen, was written on it, followed by her own, Lin Chen. Next to it, he placed a small, heavy object. A tarnished silver star, the badge of a U.S. Marshal. My name is Arthur Bishop, he said, his voice low. I was a U.S. Marshal. And I've been hunting Jedediah Kane for the better part of a year. The story came out in pieces, dragged from a place of deep pain. Kane wasn't just a common outlaw. He was a predator who preyed on the weak and the isolated. He ran a sophisticated operation, using his gang to terrorize homesteaders off their land, then using forged documents and bribed clerks to seize their claims. Your husband, Arthur said, his gaze fixed on the deed, was one of them. But he was different. He was smart. He figured out what Kane was doing. He found proof, copies of the fraudulent claims Kane had filed. He wasn't just another laborer, he was keeping records of everything. Lynn sank into her chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. The official story was that Wei had died in a blasting accident, a tragic but common misfortune on the railroad. It was no accident, Arthur confirmed her unspoken fear. Wei was about to expose him. He sent a letter to the marshal's office in Carson City. It had everything in it. Names, dates, a copy of one of Kane's forgeries. It landed on my desk. I was assigned the case. But before I could get to him, Kane found out. He arranged the accident. Lynn closed her eyes, a fresh wave of grief washing over her, sharp and bitter. Her quiet, gentle Wei had been murdered. He had died not just as a laborer, but as a man fighting for justice. I went after Kane, Arthur continued, his voice tight with anger. But he's slippery. He has eyes and ears everywhere. He turned the tables. Put a price on my head, spread rumors that I was a corrupt lawman on his payroll. He made me a fugitive. The very men who should have been helping me were hunting me. I've been on the run for months, trying to get to you. To protect this, he tapped the deed on the table. This is the last piece of original evidence. It's the key to proving everything. I wasn't running from Kane when I came here. I was running to you. The whole world had shifted beneath Lynn's feet. The solitude she had cultivated as a shield was a prison built on a lie. Her husband's memory, which she had polished and kept safe like her teacup, was incomplete. He was not just a victim, he was a hero. And this man, this giant gunslinger, was not a harbinger of random violence, but the last echo of her husband's courage. She looked at him, truly looked at him, for the first time. She saw the deep exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of the burden he carried. He had risked everything, his career, his life, to see justice done for a dead Chinese railroad worker nobody else cared about. She stood and walked to the small chest where she kept her husband's few possessions. She retrieved a small, lacquered box. Inside was a bundle of letters tied with a simple string. They were Wei's letters to her, from when he first came to America. She had read them so many times the paper was soft as cloth. She placed the box on the table next to the marshal's badge. He wrote to me about this land, she said, her voice soft but clear. He said it was not rich, but it was honest. A place we could build a life where no one could tell us where to stand or what to be. She looked directly at Arthur Bishop. For 2 years, I have been silent. I have been invisible. I thought that was the only way to be safe. She took a breath, a decision solidifying in her heart. I will not be silent anymore. It was a vow. A costly choice to abandon the perceived safety of the shadows and step into the light, to stand with this hunted man and fight for the truth of her husband's life and death. As if summoned by her words, a new sound began to build outside, the same low rumble as before, but deeper, multiplied. Arthur was at the window in an instant. The horizon was black with riders. It was not a vanguard this time. It was an army. Cain had kept his promise. The cabin was surrounded, a tiny island in a sea of malice. Arthur checked his revolver, spinning the cylinder. 6 bullets. He looked around the small, defensible cabin, at the single door and 2 small windows. He looked at Lynn, who stood not with fear, but with a quiet, unshakable resolve. They think we're trapped, he said, a grim smile touching his lips for the first time. They don't know this land. Your husband chose it for a reason. He looked toward the sheer rock bluff that rose directly behind the cabin, a feature she had always considered a useless, barren backdrop to her hard life. He was a smart man, Arthur repeated. Tell me, Mrs. Chen. Is there another way out of here? Lynn's eyes followed his gaze to the cliff face. A flicker of memory, a detail she had long forgotten, surfaced. Wei, struggling with a heavy pickaxe, muttering about a hidden spring and an easier way to haul water in the driest months. He had called it his secret passage. Hope, fierce and sudden, bloomed in her chest. Yes, she said. I think there is. Under the sliver of a new moon, the world was painted in shades of charcoal and ink. Cain's men were confident, camped in a wide, lazy circle around the cabin, their fires like angry red eyes in the darkness. They expected a desperate, hopeless fight at dawn. They were not expecting their prey to simply vanish. The passage was barely a crack in the rock face, hidden behind a thicket of stubborn, thorny scrub brush at the back of the cabin. Wei had widened it just enough for a man to pass through sideways. It was a place of deep cold and profound darkness, smelling of damp earth and stone. Lynn led the way, her smaller frame fitting more easily through the narrowest parts. Arthur followed, his broad shoulders scraping against the rock walls, his breathing a steady presence behind her. She knew this path not by sight, but by memory and feel, her hands tracing the familiar contours of the rock her husband had once carved. They emerged a quarter of a mile away, high up on the bluff, the outlaws' campfires spread out below them like a scattered constellation. From a small, hidden alcove, Wei had tethered a tough little Mustang, a contingency for an escape he must have known he might one day need. It was a ghost of his foresight, a final gift. They didn't just run. They had a destination. Argenta, the nearest town with a telegraph office, was a hard 2-day ride to the north. They rode through the night and the next day, pushing the horse and themselves to the limits of their endurance. They spoke little, the urgency of their mission a silent bond between them. In those long hours, a quiet respect grew. He saw in her a strength as unyielding as the desert landscape. She saw in him a deep well of honor that his violent life had not been able to poison. They reached Argenta, a dusty collection of clapboard buildings, late on the second day. While Lynn bought them bread and water, Arthur went to the telegraph office. He handed the clerk his tarnished badge and a coded message. The clerk's eyes widened, but he sent the message without a word. It was addressed to the territorial governor, a man Arthur had once served with. It detailed Cain's entire operation, his location, and the names of his key lieutenants. It was a warrant signed with his own reputation. They waited. For a full day, they waited in a small, cheap hotel room, the tension stretching thin. Then, the news came. A federal posse, dispatched by the governor, had descended on the unsuspecting outlaw camp. Cain and his men, trapped by their own siege, had been captured with barely a shot fired. The reign of Jedediah Cain was over. 6 months later, spring had come to the high desert. The snow had melted from the distant peaks, and the once brown land was brushed with the pale green of new growth. The homestead was transformed. The cabin was the same, but now it had a sturdy new corral holding a small herd of cattle. A chicken coop stood near a carefully tended garden where green shoots were pushing through the dark soil. The air of lonely survival was gone, replaced by a quiet hum of life and purpose. Arthur Bishop, his name cleared and his honor restored, had been offered his marshal's badge back. He had politely refused. He had found something more compelling than a badge. He had found a home. Lynn was in her garden, her hands in the cool earth, when he came to her. He wasn't wearing his gun belt. In his large hands, he held a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. He set it on the porch railing beside her single, chipped porcelain teacup. He unwrapped it to reveal 2 new cups, clean and white, without a single flaw. He did not say a word. He didn't have to. The gesture spoke of a future, of permanence, of replacing what was broken with something whole. He was building a new life, a shared life, piece by careful piece. She stood and wiped the dirt from her hands onto her apron. She reached out and laid her hand on his, her small fingers resting against his calloused skin. The light pink silk dress she had worn that first day was carefully folded away in a chest, a memory of a past self. She was no longer invisible, and she was no longer alone. In a land that so often measured a person's worth by the strength of their fists or the speed of their draw, they had discovered a different truth. They learned that sometimes the most profound strength was found in a quiet act of courage, and the most enduring justice began with a simple cup of water offered to a thirsty stranger. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.